There is a record on file at the Meridian Compact's Central Archive, cataloged under an incident number that most officers who requested it later wished they hadn't, because reading it required them to revise something they had believed about a species they thought they understood. The record concerned a recovery specialist named Owen Marsh. It did not begin with him. It began, as these things usually do, with a room full of people who had already decided what he was. The Compact's Joint Recovery Service had been pulling the living and the dead out of the space between worlds for 204 years. Its work was unglamorous in the way that most necessary things are unglamorous. When a mining habitat lost pressure, when a freighter's drive cracked in transit, when a colony's atmosphere plant failed, on the far side of a system where no fleet could reach in time, it was the recovery service that arrived. Its people were not soldiers. They were not diplomats. They were the ones who went into the wreckage after everyone else had accepted that the wreckage was final. And they came out more often than the mathematics should have allowed, carrying someone who was still breathing. The service drew its personnel from 31 member species. It did not select on the basis of origin. It selected on the basis of who came back. This was officially the policy, and the policy was true, which did not stop it from being incomplete. Any institution that has existed for 2 centuries accumulates a second set of beliefs underneath the written ones, a sediment of assumption about which species were built for which work, who the founders had imagined when they wrote the founding charter, and who had arrived later after the shape of things had already been decided, and been asked to fit themselves into a frame that had not been measured for them. Humanity had held compact membership for 26 years. Humans had served in the recovery service for 14. In 14 years, the service had certified 9 human specialists at the senior grade. The current intake at the Varus Training Annex had one. His name was Owen Marsh. He was 34 years old, which made him older than most of the candidates around him. And he had come from a place called Cinder Reach, a hard rock mining colony on the trailing edge of a system that appeared on compact charts mainly as a hazard notation. He had arrived at the annex with a service file that the intake coordinator had read through twice, not because it was long, but because the first reading had produced a set of numbers she assumed were a transcription error. She had queried them. The query came back verified. She had sat with that for a while before she approved him, and she had not told him she had done so. Owen did not seem to expect that anyone had done so. He arrived, found his assigned quarters, learned the layout of the annex the way a person learns the layout of a place they intend to be useful in rather than comfortable in, and attended his sessions with the particular quality of a man who was interested in the work and almost entirely uninterested in where he stood relative to the people doing it beside him. He was not unfriendly. He was simply elsewhere, in the way that some people are elsewhere, present in the room and attending to something the room could not see. The room, for its part, was very interested in him. Part of this was novelty. Humans were still rare enough in the senior grades that a human in the intake drew attention the way any anomaly draws attention. But part of it was something older and less generous, and it gathered over the first weeks around a candidate named Vask. Vask was Sarn. The Sarn were a heavy species, broad through the shoulder and dense through the bone, built by a homeworld with punishing gravity and a long cultural memory of surviving it. They were, by any honest measure, extraordinary at the physical dimension of recovery work. A Sarn specialist could carry loads through failing structures that would have crushed most other species, could endure pressure differentials that would have ruptured softer bodies, could work in cold that would have stopped a human's hands inside of minutes. The Sarn knew this about themselves. It was not arrogance exactly. It was closer to the settled confidence of a people who had been told their whole lives that they were the ones the hard jobs were made for, and who had never encountered a reason to doubt it. Vask stood near the top of the annex rankings. He was good, and he knew he was good, and he had arrived at the annex carrying the assumption, held so deeply that he had never thought to examine it, that a human belonged in the recovery service the way a paper lantern belonged in a foundry. Decorative. Fragile, present by some administrative courtesy that had not yet been corrected. The instructor who oversaw the doctrine sessions was a coordinator named Senate. She was Austreni, a species that ran long and gray and quiet, and she had spent 40 years in the field before she was pulled back to teach, which meant she had done the work Vask was still learning to do before Vask's parents had met. She ran her sessions in a seminar format, 12 candidates around a table, the teaching built on the assumption that the candidates would argue with each other, and that she would say very little while they did. She had read Owen's file in the second week. She had said nothing about it. She had, however, begun to wait. The confrontation came in the 6th week, in a session on the doctrine of unsupported extraction, the branch of recovery work concerned with what a specialist does when there is no backup, no relay, no possibility of reinforcement, and the only resources available are the ones the specialist carried in with them. It was, in the abstract, the most demanding doctrine the service taught, and it was taught late in the intake because most candidates could not yet imagine the conditions it described. They had trained in simulators with safety cutouts and observation teams. The idea of going into a failing structure alone, with the door closing behind you and no one coming, was to most of them a theoretical extreme, a thing that lived in the archives and the memorial plaques, and not in the world they expected to work in. Vask introduced the human question the way certain people introduce questions, which is to say with the timing and the tone of someone who had rehearsed it, and was pleased with it. He waited for a pause in the discussion, one of those natural gaps where the conversation is between topics, and he addressed the table generally in a way that made it clear the address was specific. "It might be useful," Vask said, "before we go further into unsupported extraction to establish a baseline. Doctrine is easier to discuss when we know the realistic capacities of the people we're discussing it for." He let that sit for a moment. Several candidates had already begun to smile, the particular smile that appears in rooms where a hierarchy is being enforced and the observers have decided which side they are standing on. "For the sake of grounding the theory," Vask went on, and here he turned not quite all the way toward Owen, "how many recoveries would a human specialist realistically log before certification?" At Marsh's stage. As a reference point. It was a well-built cruelty. It looked, on the surface, like a reasonable request for data. Underneath, it carried the assumption plainly that the human number would be small, that stating it aloud would embarrass him, that the honest answer would end the discussion in Vask's favor, and establish quietly and on the record what everyone at the table had already privately concluded. Sennett, at the head of the table, said nothing. She had been waiting for this since the second week, and she recognized it now the way a person recognizes weather they have been watching build on the horizon. Owen did not answer immediately. He looked at Vask with the particular steadiness that Sennett had noticed and catalogued over the preceding weeks. A pair of unremarkable brown eyes that did not shift in response to what was happening around him, only in response to what he was thinking, so that watching his face was like watching a window into a room whose weather had nothing to do with the weather outside it. He appeared, if anything, to be considering the question as a genuine question, turning it over to find the honest shape of it. "That depends what you're counting," Owen said. The answer was so plain, so free of the defensiveness Vask had been fishing for, that a few of the smiles wavered. Vask recovered. "Recoveries," he said with the patience of a man laying out the terms of his own joke. "Living extractions." People pulled out breathing. "Whatever number you'd put on your file." "Do you want the number from Cinder Reach?" Owen said. "Or the total?" There was a small silence at that. The distinction was strange. Cinder Reach was a mining colony, not a service posting. A candidate's file recorded service recoveries, work done under the Recovery Service's flag, logged and certified. There was no obvious reason a mining colony would generate a recovery count at all. Vask, who had not expected the question to have parts, chose the one that sounded larger. "The total," he said. "Let's use the total." Owen said a number. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a slope goes quiet before it fails. The candidates nearest to Owen first, the ones close enough to have heard it cleanly, and then outward, seat by seat, as each person processed the figure and ran their own internal check against everything they believed about a human's realistic capacity, and found the two things would not reconcile. Vask ran the check faster than most because he had the most invested in the result, and he arrived at the only conclusion his framework could produce. "That isn't possible," he said. There was less patience in it now. "Not for a human, not at your grade. That's not a certified figure." "Most of it isn't service work," Owen said. "That's why I asked which number you wanted." He said it without any particular weight, the way a person corrects a small factual error, and that was somehow worse for Vask than defiance would have been, because defiance he could have answered. "The service recoveries are in my file, they're certified. The rest is from Cinder Reach. Those aren't logged the same way. But they happened." "Then they don't count," Vask said, and he reached for the word the way a man reaches for a rail on a moving deck, because it was the last solid thing his position had left to hold. "If they're not certified, they didn't happen." It was at this point that Coordinator Sennett spoke for the first time since the question had been asked. "The Cinder Reach recoveries are documented," she said, "not in service format, in the colony's own emergency logs, which the compact archived when Cinder Reach joined the relief network 11 years ago. I've had them retrieved." She turned the flat gray of her attention toward the table at large. "Since we are discussing unsupported extraction, and since we appear to have someone at this table who has practiced it under conditions none of the rest of you have encountered, it seems inefficient not to look at the actual record." She did not wait for agreement. She reached to the panel at her position and brought the far wall of the room to life. What followed was a little under an hour, and Sennett had structured it deliberately, because she had read the logs, and she understood that what they contained was not merely a large number waiting to impress people. What they contained was a complete and specific education in exactly the doctrine the session had been convened to study, delivered not by an instructor but by a man who had learned it the only way it can truly be learned, which is by surviving it. She did not begin with the biggest incident. She began with the smallest because she wanted the room to understand the texture of the thing before it understood the scale. The first log was 14 years old. Cinder Reach Owen would have been 20, a shift hand in the deep galleries, no title, no training, nothing that would have appeared on a compact record. A rock burst had collapsed a crosscut and sealed 4 miners behind a fall of stone with a failing air pocket and a fire on the far side eating what was left of it. The colony had no rescue team. Colonies like Cinder Reach did not have rescue teams. They had whoever was nearest and willing, and the willing were rarely near, because the nature of a rock burst is that everyone who understands rock has already run the numbers and knows what the numbers say. The log was not dramatic footage. It was the flat, poorly lit record of a colony safety camera, time-stamped, the kind of visual document that carries weight, precisely because no one made it to be watched. It showed a young man going back into a gallery that everyone else was coming out of. It showed him doing this 4 times. The log recorded, in the toneless language of colony safety systems, the atmospheric readings inside the crosscut, across the period he was in it, and anyone in the room with the training to read those numbers, which was everyone in the room, understood without being told that the young man in the recording had been breathing air that should not have kept him conscious, in heat that should not have let him work, and had kept going into it anyway, past the point where his own survival stopped being a reasonable expectation, because there were 4 people on the other side of the stone and no one else was going to go. He had brought all 4 out. The log recorded that too in the same flat language, as though it were an unremarkable fact and not a thing that should not have happened. Sennett let that one finish before she moved on. She had timed it so the room would have to sit with it. The second incident was 3 years later. The third was 2 years after that. She moved through them in order, and as she did, something began to happen to the room that Vask, watching from his seat near the middle of the table, was slower than most to name, because naming it required him to give up a belief he had not known he was holding until he felt it come loose. The incidents were not the same. That was the thing that got past the room's defenses. If they had all been the same, the candidates could have filed them away as a single kind of luck repeated. But they were not the same. They were a man learning. The early logs showed someone doing an impossible thing badly, going in without a plan, coming out by margins that were clearly accidents of nerve rather than method. The later logs showed the same man doing impossible things with structure, sealing routes behind him to buy air on the far side, choosing which of 2 trapped groups to reach first based on a triage calculation that the service taught in its 3rd-year doctrine module, and that this man had apparently derived on his own, in the dark, alone, with no one to check his work and no one coming if he got it wrong. By the 6th log, the room had stopped being a room where a human was being tested and become a room where 12 specialists and 1 instructor were watching something actively revise their understanding of what the discussion they had been having was actually about. The doctrine of unsupported extraction, which most of them had been treating as an archival extreme, was unfolding on the wall in front of them as a lived and repeated practice, worked out from first principles by a person who had never read the doctrine, because at the time he had done it, there had been no one to hand it to him. Vask stopped smiling somewhere around the 5th log. By the 7th he had stopped watching Owen entirely and was watching the wall with the expression of a man performing a calculation. He already knew he was not going to finish inside the session, because the calculation was not about the number anymore. The number had been the small part. The number was just the count of times a man had done, a thing the room had believed a human could not do. The large part was everything the number implied about the person, and about the assumption Vask had carried into the room, and about the confidence with which he had carried it. There was one log Senet had chosen to place near the end, and she placed it deliberately, because it was the one that had made her sit still in her office when she first read it, and she wanted the room to feel what she had felt. Owen would have been 26. A gallery fire in the lower workings, spreading through the ventilation before the alarms had caught up to it, had trapped a shift of 11 behind a bulkhead that had sealed automatically to contain the burn. The seal was working exactly as designed. It was keeping the fire out. It was also keeping the 11 in a space with a finite volume of air and a fire on the other side of the door consuming the colony's ability to reach them. The correct procedure by every safety doctrine anyone in the room had studied was to hold the seal and let the fire burn itself down, and to recover the 11 afterward when it was safe, understanding that afterward would be too late for most of them, and that this was the cost of not losing anyone else. It was a defensible calculation. Senet had made versions of it herself in 40 years of field work, and she carried the ones she had made the way everyone in the service carried them. The log showed Owen overriding the seal. Not the whole seal. He had done something the colony's own engineers described, in the incident review that followed, as improvised beyond the manufacturer's tolerances, cracking the bulkhead against its own safety programming for intervals of a few seconds at a time, timed against the fire's oxygen draw, so that he could pass through into the trapped space and back out again in the windows, when the pressure differential pulled the flame away from the gap rather than into it. He had done this repeatedly. The log recorded the temperature at the bulkhead across the period, and the room could read it, and the room understood that what they were watching was a man who had built in his head in real time under a load of fear that the recording could not show but that everyone present could imagine. A working model of a fire's behavior, precise enough to bet 11 lives and his own on the timing of it. He had brought out 9. The log recorded that. It also recorded the 2 he had not brought out, because Cinder Reach logged its dead, with the same flat honesty it logged its living, and Senet had not edited them out, because to edit them out would have been to tell the room a lie about what the work was. The doctrine of unsupported extraction is not a doctrine about winning. It is a doctrine about what a person does when the situation has already decided that some part of it is going to be lost, and the only remaining question is how much, and who is willing to stand in the gap and argue with the arithmetic. When the last log ended, Senet turned the wall off. For a moment the room held the particular silence of people who have been shown something they will need time to finish absorbing. Unsupported extraction, she said into that silence, is most usefully studied not as theory but as practice. We had a request earlier to establish a baseline for what a human specialist realistically brings to this doctrine. She looked with the precise neutrality of a good instructor toward Vask. It was a reasonable request. The answer, as we've now seen, is that the baseline assumptions were the thing that needed correcting. She dismissed the session. The candidates filed out slowly, and several of them slowed further as they passed Owen's place at the table. Not to speak to him. There was nothing yet that any of them knew how to say, but with the specific altered body language of people who had recalibrated something and had not yet worked out what the recalibration required of them. One of them, an oral candidate who had said nothing the entire session, paused, as though to say something, found nothing prepared that was equal to it, and went out. Vask was the last to move. He stopped at the door and stood there for a moment with the expression of a man who had asked a question expecting a small, deflating answer and had received instead a complete and irreversible correction to his sense of the world. When he spoke, it was not to Owen exactly. It was to the room in the manner of a person finishing a thought he had started an hour earlier under the impression it was going to end differently. "The Cinder Reach number," he said, "and the certified number. They're different." "By about 40, Owen said. He did not say it to wound. That was, Senet would reflect later, the thing that made it land the way it did. He said it the way a person confirms a fact that has stopped mattering to him, because the difference between the two numbers had never been the point, and he seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone might think it was. The point had been the 4 miners in the first log, and the 11 behind the bulkhead, and the 9 he had brought out, and the 2 he had not. The number was just the bruise the record left. It was not the record. Vask stood with that for a moment. Then he did something that the Annex would talk about for a while afterward, because it was not the sort of thing the Sarn were expected to find easy. He crossed the room, and he stopped in front of Owen, and he looked down at him from the considerable height the Sarn possessed, and he said, I would not have gone back the fourth time. In the first one, I want you to know that I understand that. It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. An apology would have been about Vask. This was about the thing Vask had finally seen, and it cost him more to say than an apology would have, and Owen recognized the cost, and he did the only thing that would honor it, which was to take it plainly. Most people wouldn't, Owen said. That's the whole reason the doctrine exists. Vask inclined his head, a Sarn gesture weighted not given lightly, and went out. Owen began gathering his materials from the table. Among them was an object that had drawn a certain amount of quiet commentary from the other candidates over the preceding weeks, because it was old and battered and out of place in a room full of current issue equipment. A hand-cranked field beacon of a type the service had stopped issuing before most of the candidates were born, its casing scored and dented, one edge worn smooth where a thumb had ridden it across what must have been thousands of hours. It was not standard kit. It had no place on a modern specialist's belt. He had carried it every day of the intake anyway, clipped where his hand could reach it without looking, and no one had asked him why, because there is a kind of object a person carries that announces without a word that the question would not be welcome. Sennett was still at the head of the table. She had watched him carry the beacon for 6 weeks, and she had chosen not to ask. She asked now because the session had earned it. "The beacon," she said. "It isn't issue. It hasn't been issue for 30 years. Owen looked at it in his hand for a moment before he answered. Something moved in his face. Not the steadiness she had grown used to, but something underneath it, briefly visible. "It was my father's," he said. "He ran colony safety at Cinder Reach before me. The first fire, the one you showed first. I was 20. I didn't know what I was doing. I went in on nerve." He turned the beacon slightly, the way a person turns thing they have turned 10,000 times. "This is what he used to find me. I'd been in the gallery longer than I should have been. Air was going. I couldn't have made it back on my own. I'd lost which way was out. He came in after me with this, cranking it so I'd have a sound to walk toward, because the beacon puts out a tone even when there's no power and no relay and nothing else in the world is working. He clipped it back onto his belt in its worn place. He didn't come back out. The fall took the roof behind me while I was walking toward the sound. I got the 4 minors. I got myself. I didn't get him." He said it without drama, in the plain register of a man reporting a fact he had made his peace with a long time ago, and it was the plainness that made it enormous. "I carry it," he said, "because it's the only piece of equipment I've ever used that I trust completely. It has never once failed to make the sound, and in this work, at the point where the doctrine actually applies. No power, no relay, nothing coming, that's the only thing that matters. Not how strong you are, not how many recoveries are in your file, whether there's a sound for the person in the dark to walk toward, and whether you're willing to be the one making it." He looked up at her. "That's all unsupported extraction is. Everything else is just equipment." Sennett, who had spent 40 years in the field and had believed there was very little about the work she had not already understood, found that she had been given something. She did not say so. Instructors of her caliber rarely do. "You already had the logs retrieved," Owen said. "It was not a question. Before today, since the second week," Sennett said. "I was waiting for the right session, and," she added, with something that on an Ostreni face passed for dry humor, "for someone to ask the right wrong question." Owen almost smiled at that. Then he picked up the rest of his materials, and the old beacon rode at his hip where it always rode, and he walked out of the room, leaving the coordinator alone at the head of the table with the wall dark and the logs closed. Sennett sat for a while. Then she opened the intake performance record and began to enter her assessment of the session, and when she reached the field for the candidate named Marsh, she stopped because the standard assessment vocabulary, proficient, exceptional, recommend for advancement, had all at once become inadequate to the thing she was trying to record. The forms were built to rank candidates against a doctrine. She had spent the last hour watching a candidate who had arrived already carrying the doctrine inside him, worked out in the dark, at a cost the forms had no column for. In the end she wrote 4 words, and then closed the record, and sat a while longer in the quiet room before she rose. Under Owen Marsh she had written he should be teaching. The record on file at the Compact's Central Archive ends there, formally, but there is a smaller entry, appended 11 months later, that anyone who requests the original will find attached to it, and it is the reason the record is quietly famous among people in the recovery service who have read it. 11 months later, a training vessel out of the Varus Annex lost containment during a routine transit exercise. The doctrine in that situation was clear. Hold the intact sections, seal the breach, wait for the escort. The escort was 40 minutes out. Everyone aboard understood that 40 minutes was longer than the trapped section had. The vessel's own log records that a specialist went into the breach section against procedure, alone, with the escort still 38 minutes out, and no backup and no relay, and that he did this using a piece of non-standard equipment to maintain contact with the 6 trapped crew across a gap where every modern system had failed. An old hand-cranked field beacon, off-pattern, unissued for 30 years, that put out a tone even when there was no power and nothing else in the world was working, so that 6 people in the dark had a sound to walk toward. The log records that all 6 came out. The log records that the specialist who went in for them was a first-year instructor, recently certified to teach the doctrine of unsupported extraction, and that among the 6 he brought out was a heavy worlder, a Sarn, who had frozen in the dark not from cold, which the Sarn do not fear, but from the particular disorientation of a person who cannot find the way out, and who had walked, in the end, toward a sound. The Sarn's name is in the log. It is the same name that appears, 11 months earlier, in the record of a doctrine seminar, asking a question he thought he already knew the answer to. He knows the answer now. So does everyone who has read the record. The answer was never the number. The answer was always the sound in the dark, and the person willing to be the one making it, and the plain, unglamorous, unrepeatable fact that some people go back in when the arithmetic has already told them not to, and that when they do, the arithmetic, for once, is the thing that turns out to be wrong.